Hello and welcome to our online lecture. I want to talk to you today about how Atlanta changes after the Civil War. Um, Atlanta, in many respects, becomes the best case study of both liberation as well as oppression in the American South. So, we are going to sort of extend this lecture to include a number of things, but to really bring specific attention to Atlanta. Um, as I said in class, and one of my favorite sayings is without Atlanta, Georgia is Mississippi. And I really hope to bring some perspective to this quotation in our lecture today. As a quick example, or rather reminder, before the Civil War, Atlanta is a very small town, but it is significant in that it has railroads. We see the beginning of railroads in Georgia around the 1830s. These railroads, in some way, are connecting different rivers and along those paths, but they really have the emphasis of trying to connect the cities with the ports and the port of Savannah, which is critical to getting cotton in and out and to other parts of the country for industry and to make that cotton into other forms. Before the Civil War, obviously, there are also free communities in Georgia. Those free communities are much more likely to be found in the outskirts of cities, or rather in close proximity to cities, rather than in the rural or sort of other more rural parts of the state. Enslaved labor was the primary way that if you see buildings that are around before the Civil War, they're built by slave labor, including the University of Georgia's campus, Oglethorpe, parts of Emory, and other buildings, right? All of this construction would have gone on. It was done by those who were enslaved. So there is visual reminders of this time period before the Civil War across the state. Also, before the Civil War, there are mills, lots of mills, but not a lot of industry. So we will see this as one of certainly the more visible signs of changes to come. As we talked about in class, the Atlanta campaign is taking Atlanta, really cutting off supplies to the rest of the South and literally burning the state to the ground. Um, in this, you also have the Great Strike of those who are enslaved, as Du Bois writes about in Black Reconstruction in America, also going on. As a consequence of this, there will be a internal migration in the South to both free communities that are already in existence around cities and also into cities themselves. So, although the Great Migration is the term that refers to migration of African Americans in and around the First World War, a internal mini migration is going on of African Americans leaving rural plantations and moving to the cities. Excuse me. During Reconstruction, one of the more visible visual presences was the arrival of the Freedmen's Bureau. Remember, Atlanta specifically is under military lockdown. It is governed by martial law. There is a visible military presence across Atlanta and in other parts of the state. I would also keep in mind that Reconstruction is creating the era of Black owned businesses, is going to create Black politicians. Reconstruction will see um, the creation of entire middle and upper class that is in many ways supported by the colleges established by the Freedmen's Bureau. Freedmen Bureau's agents are in Atlanta and across the South to address immediate needs of newly freed people, but also to establish and provide education. Um, Along with this, we see the movement of Morehouse from basically Richmond County to Atlanta, the development of Spelman College, Atlanta University, and Clark College. Um, there are some excellent images that we could look at to really bring some of this to life. And as you know, I like images. I think they're helpful in understanding and applying historical ideas. So Atlanta has been burned, right? So the idea of reconstruction really takes on this momentum of how to do it, what Atlanta is going to look like. And this is an example of Oak, I think it's of the cemetery. Um, that is right off of Memorial Avenue, Oakland Cemetery. That's still there. There will be a rebuilding, right, of the physical city itself, that will have to be done. And again, the visuals are just here to sort of show us what this undertaking is going to look like, as well as those who, let's take a quick look at this, who are in the process of helping in this reconstruction effort. Oh, yikes. Never mind. Okay. This is a much more legitimate source. Atlanta, right, by 1861. So here we go. This is what Atlanta's going to look like before the campaign, and obviously we know what it's going to look like afterwards. This is, of course, Union Station, right at the center of 5 Points, so what would be now considered downtown Atlanta. Well, it's taking too long, so I will just give you those visuals and move on. All right. Um, Again, as I said, there are around 98,000 Union soldiers in Atlanta. So again, the city is definitely feeling a federal martial presence. By 1870, the port of Savannah becomes the fourth largest in the Southeast. And by the 1890s, we have a term for the beginning of the industrial South called the New South, where we really see new industries moving down to the South for the first time, including Ford Motors. You see really the expansion of the textile industry, meaning not only is the cotton produced in the South, but the locations for turning that cotton into other things will also be in the South for the first time. We'll also see, oh, I didn't even write this down, Coca-Cola, right? Coca-Cola will emerge in Atlanta by the 1890s, becoming one of the world's biggest industries. By 1920, you have around 200,000 people living in Atlanta. And although it's not the biggest city in the South, it is poised to become that in the decades that follow. And during Reconstruction, Sweet Auburn Avenue was known as the richest Negro street in the world. One generation after enslavement, it became the epicenter of Black wealth in Atlanta, and for many, the symbol of Black excellence across the country. Alonzo Herndon is the first Black millionaire in Atlanta. He owned and operated Atlanta Life as an insurance company, but he also bought a number of buildings, including the Rucker Building. He also owned barbershops and other commercial properties in and along Sweet Auburn Avenue. His wife was also a major philanthropist in the city. She was she taught theater at Spelman. She was an artist and contributed to bringing culture to Atlanta, doing operas, doing plays, and really trying to elevate the sophistication of the city. Um, in that first generation after enslavement, there were Black banks, Black newspapers, certainly Black institutions, but also Black cultural contributions across the city. The Atlanta Daily Worker, which is still around today online, is one of the oldest Black newspapers, which begins in 1928. Um, I mean, in Atlanta, there will be others, but this one is still around. And of course, the establishment of Clark College and Atlanta University. In 1906, the success of the Black middle class comes under fire by white Atlantans who attack in 1906. This is not an isolated incident, as we see this going on across the United States in the decades after Reconstruction and into the 20th century. In the case of Atlanta, the media very much helps to inspire this by popularizing attacks of white women in the newspaper. This is also a gubernatorial election. Both governors of Georgia are running on a platform of Black disenfranchisement to deny Black citizens the rights to vote. Um, in this particular riot, um, African Americans are also armed, trying to defend homes, livelihoods, and of course, one's own life. Police officer killed, African Americans are killed. There is an approximation of 30 people, but that is also underestimated. Um, it'll take decades before the sort of culmination of this attack is really calculated. And it will only be in the early part of the 21st century that historians and the city starts to commemorate and remember the tragedy of this event. Walter White, who is a African American, but although is passes as white, is on one of the trolleys in Atlanta and witnesses the violence firsthand as a child, and goes on to recount this moment in his life as a life altering moment. Du Bois, um, W.E.B. Du Bois, who was a professor at Atlanta University, also writes the poem A Litany for Atlanta as a response to this. I'm not going to go into Du Bois as much here, just due to lack of um, space, but I do want, again, to show you what is demonstrated in this 1900 exhibit of the American Negro in Paris. And of course, you'll recognize these stairs as that of Atlanta University. And again, I always marvel at the picture of these four students, considering how these roads are not paved, there is no air conditioning, there are no cars. They are walking around in the exposure of all that is the Georgia heat and air, and just the remarkableness of their clothing, their posture, and the grace that you see throughout these photographs. Um, these photographs are a counter narrative to what people in the world thought of African Americans in 1900 during an age of white supremacy. What we see is Black excellence depicted at every corner, whether it be biology, lawyers, and portraiture. Seeing these images of the Black American family in this way very much challenge stereotypes, and these ideas of unsavage of savage people needing um, refinement. Um, so these are such important historical legacies. It's also important to note, although you wouldn't be able to go now, that much of this data is on display at the Apex Museum in Atlanta. Um, Again, we see students at Roger Williams University in Nashville. We see women engaged in seamstressy, carpentry classes. Again, all aspects of workers' lives, which Du Bois very much would have wanted to showcase as a documentarian himself of the African American family. That's what his research demonstrated. Right, so look at this. So we see this is a condition of 300 Black farm tenants after around 1898. Most African Americans are in debt because of the system that's put into place of tenant farming. So you see how the system itself is producing a level of indebtedness that people can't seem to get out of for farmers. Of course, there are also other occupations because of the industrial South. This picture is also so amazing in the Sisters of the Holy Family in New York. In New Orleans. But we have a collection of evidence to go back to really give us a counterweight of what um, the sort of breadth of the Black experience. In terms of African American women in Atlanta, Lucy Smith becomes the first woman, um, a Black woman, to hold positions as leaders of union organizations. The Black women in Atlanta and the uh, who actually went on strike in 1881. This domestic strike included nearly 3,000 women, and the you have to think about the ways that these women organized themselves, how they understood this, and the ways that this strike would have gone on. Certainly, one of the reasons why we see this creation of the Black middle class in Atlanta is because of access to education and the role of the Atlanta University Center, which was not only producing professionals, but Black women involved in suffrage, involved in child labor laws, involved in creating educational opportunities, medical equality, all aspects of public life. So this was done through Black sororities, Black church, the Black women's club movement, and all of these different socially active, community based organizations. Of course, there are certainly tensions and problems existing and issues of classism within Black communities as well, which also give us a much more rich, nuanced understanding of this history. Um, Atlanta and the Atlanta University Center will continue to inspire activism across this time period. Although somehow this didn't make it onto my slide, in the 1950s, the Atlanta University Center is accused of being a hotbed of communism activity because it is creating these generation of social activists. Um, if you're not as familiar with the communism of the 1950s, then you're probably much more familiar with the Atlanta student movement of the 1960s and the significant way that students from Spelman, Morehouse, and Atlanta University and Clark College were the vanguard of changing segregation laws in the city of Atlanta. Students at the various institutions wrote and published an appeal for human rights that was published in different newspapers. They organized economic boycotts of both um, Woolworths as well as Rich's Department Store, which was one of the largest places to shop in the city. And of course, being involved in this became criminal. This happened both inside of Atlanta and outside of Atlanta, as very young activists, even in rural parts of the state, were basically imprisoned for their student leadership. And we'll talk about this at another time as well. In the 1940s is certainly under the era of World War II and the beginning of the Cold War, we start to see some segregationist policies effectively challenged. In Atlanta, the first Black police officers are hired to work in the city in 1948. Desegregation efforts are emerging both inside the military and outside. And as Atlanta and Georgia wants access to federal dollars, the federal government is advocating policies of hiring of African Americans, which the state of Georgia doesn't want to do. Hiring the first Black police officers then also came with specific restrictions, such as these officers could not arrest whites, they could not carry weapons, they could not enter through the front door, and were only stationed in predominantly African American neighborhoods. They won't have cars. They will be regulated and relegated. Um, there are a number of ways to look at this particular history, but focusing on the individual lives is an effective mechanism. Willie Elkins, he is one of the first African Americans hired to work for Lockheed Martin, which is in Marietta. And often his stories were used to sort of demonstrate the plight of police officers, of Black police officers in Atlanta during a time of intense racial segregation and oppression. One of the things that you certainly see demonstrated in the city of Atlanta is the ways that whites resisted efforts of reconstruction for full equality and ways of maintaining white supremacy and segregation. The 1880s, Atlanta is the first place to open a Confederate museum, and a museum that glorified, romanticized, and mythologized the Civil War. It was also located on Confederate Avenue in Atlanta. We talked about the race riots. In 1915, the land is purchased privately to build Stone Mountain, which would also be the largest demonstration of any Confederacy memorial and symbol in America. In 1930s, as I mentioned before, there are arrests of Atlanta University professors who, again, are considered communists. In 1938, the movie Gone with the Wind premieres in Atlanta, which is based on the book Gone with the Wind, which was written by an Atlanta woman, Margaret Mitchell, who is also a significant. I'll say a few more things about her before I go. But Gone with the Wind very much celebrates the Klan, is an incredibly racist movie and book. But nonetheless, when they tried to show it in Atlanta in 1938, it was to a segregated audience. And some of the white actors refused to show up unless they allowed for Black actors to come into the theater. African American actors, of course, are excluded from this, and their protest stations don't even matter. Very quickly, Margaret Mitchell is one of the supporters of moving Morehouse, or the development of the Morehouse School of Medicine. She was one of their largest donors. She very much believed in racial segregation, and is ultimately struck down by a car who kills her as she was walking through Atlanta. In the 1940s, Georgia continues its reputation as a white supremacist state, electing numerous governors who refuse to obey federal orders of integration in the military hirings and will try to keep the state as white as possible in terms of power. In the 1950s, as we've talked about before, the state of Georgia changes its flag. And I know I don't have much credibility when I do this, but I do want to just show you again the history of the Georgia flags. All right? Nope, still not right. I'm going to find it. Don't you worry. Okay? I just want to show. All right. So these are the different flags that Georgia has flown. This becomes the flag beginning in 1954. You see how this is the flag, and then they will adopt the bars, right, to protest against Brown versus Board of Education. So visuals, again, are very helpful here. 1958, the state of Georgia will buy Stone Mountain for public participation, so the public can come, although it won't open until the 1970s. By the 1960s is the Atlanta student movement. In 1965, Stone Mountain opens to the public. In 1966, Ivan Alley names the city, or nicknames the city rather, a city too busy to hate, in opposition to what's going on in other cities across the South, such as Birmingham, particularly, which was known as Bombingham after the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church. In the 1970s in Atlanta, we get the election of the first African American mayor, Maynard Jackson, as well as a real movement out of the city. In 1968, Atlanta had its own Berlin Wall. Segregation throughout the city was very evident, and there was a pattern across Atlanta of naming different parts of the streets different names to denote white and black. In the neighborhood of Cascade Heights, there was a literal wall also built separating the white neighborhood from the black neighborhood. The symbol, of course, is that they should remove it, right? There was pressures on the mayor's office from the NAACP and many other of these women's groups to remove the wall from the neighborhood to demonstrate that we would no longer have these sort of physical separations in Atlanta. You might look at Atlanta as a microcosm for industrialization. If we spent the time looking at buildings built by enslaved labor, then the buildings from Reconstruction in the early 20th century are mostly built, if they're around from that time, were also mostly built from industrial re-enslaved labor. The New South also visibly gave us not only industry, but the remembering of the Confederacy. And you see this in every Georgia county, but also across Atlanta. In the metro, there are numerous remembrances to the Civil War. Again, as I mentioned in class, it is as if it is the only thing that has happened. If we look at the documentation of public history in Atlanta, this is what you find: a remembrance of the Confederacy with only recently public memorialization of African American history and other aspects of the city, including even the bombing in 1996. I like to think of Atlanta as developing along these parallel tracks, right? One where you see Black excellence and the emergence of the Black middle class, and the other, right, with white supremacy. As you continue to think about the ways in which Reconstruction and the legacies of Atlanta, again, we need to find ways in which you see parallels to other cities, and in what ways the unique formation of Atlanta really is unique to the city's rich history of the Black middle class and Black excellence. Thank you, and we will talk again next time about more specific to the civil rights movement.